Hi, everyone. We're back with another Eurythmics podcast. This is number 25. And I'm Rex Saldana with my co-host, Mark Stevens. Hi, Mark.
Hello there.
Today we have a special guest. I'm going to let Mark tell you all about him. Go ahead, Mark.
Really excited to have Neal Wickens on today. Neal is a very interesting guest for us because he comes in as a fan, longtime fan of Eurythmics, but he has a lot of interesting background in the music business, and specifically with BMG, and specifically with several Eurythmics projects. So we're hoping to get some inside knowledge here, some inside scoop or whatever, but also how he got there and how he grew up as a fan of Eurythmics and ended up working on some projects with them. So welcome, Neal. You're in London, I believe.
Yes, it's the day after the coronation here in the UK. It's very sunny, and I'm very excited to be here and talk about what was my job for a while, but has always been my passion, which is music and especially Eurythmics.
Well, congratulations on the coronation. Is that a right thing to say? Congratulations. I mean,
I don't know. It's like
that's my sentiment for the whole British public.
Yes, although not everyone, but we won't get into that.
Yeah.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yes.
It was very interesting to see a coronation. We haven't seen one in our lifetime, so.
No, and it always makes me think of, obviously, the classic King and Queen of America. The Americans have never had a king and a queen. So Americans, in my experience, are always fascinated with our royal family because of that.
Yeah, definitely.
I watched the whole thing, totally fascinated. So I'm one of those. So anyway, so Neal, thank you for doing this. Tell me a little bit about, if you don't mind, tell us how you became a fan of Eurythmics. It started at a very early age, actually.
Yes, I mean, I am 48 now, so I was just coming up to 8 years old when Sweet Dreams was first released here in the UK. So my birthday's in February, so it was around that time that Sweet Dreams, the single, was released. And I remember my parents had the 7-inch single, and my parents have instilled in me my love of music and love of all sorts of music. But at that age, I guess you were always drawn to what your parents were listening to. So I remember the 7-inch single with the artwork and then the video that would be shown. And the thing that I always remember was her reaching to turn the light out at the end, of the video, which I always thought was kind of sweet. So I really get my love of Eurythmics in particular from my parents. But actually, as I got older and as Eurythmics' career went on, and I was always aware of them, they were always on top of the Pops or Smash Hits, the magazines that we had over here. My sister Anna was a massive, massive fan, and particularly Savage and We Two Are One. So she always had it on. So I guess I owe a lot to my sister in particular for my love of Eurythmics. I just took it a little bit further.
Wow.
I think you said you told me once your school had the 7-inch or something for Sweet Dreams as one of the songs you could probably check out, or something in the library. I don't
know. Did we have that? Yeah. We used to have music in the library? Yes. Yeah.
My school never had any cool music to. I don't think so.
Yeah, we had music you could check out. The local libraries had like albums you could check out.
Oh, really? Okay, well, maybe that's it. So before we get started, we always try to ask fans when we have them on. So tell us, your favorite song, your favorite album from Eurythmics. You got one that you want to talk, not to put you on the spot or anything.
I mean, this is, and I have listened to a lot of your podcasts as well, and I know it's really difficult. It's like choosing your favorite child. Not that I have any children. I'm going to cheat completely, and I'm going to give you a top 5 because I can't cheat.
Yeah. That's what I would do too.
And the top 5, I mean, obviously Sweet Dreams is in there. I think it has to be in there. It's unavoidable. But gems like This City Never Sleeps is a particular favorite of mine. You Can Hear the Sound of the Underground Trains is very relevant as I live in London. And I actually used to live in an apartment built above a tube line. and you could hear the sound of the underground trains at night. So it always makes me think of that song.
You know, Neil, I identify with that because when I was young and that song was popular, walls so thin I could almost hear them breathing. I lived in apartments with walls so thin you could hear the people talking next door. So
Yes,
that's how I identified with it.
the lyrics in that song are just incredible, so evocative.
Yeah,
and the music is just wonderful. It's a fantastic way to end off the Sweet Dreams album. So I love listening to that song. Shame from the Savage album. I particularly love the extended dance remix of that one. Better to Have Lost in Love and Never to Have Loved at All from Be Yourself Tonight, a real favorite. And then you have the poster behind you there, Rex. You Have Placed a Chill in My Heart, I think is one of the finest pop songs ever written and recorded.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. Yeah.
That is a great text. I love that.
Yeah, I love Better to Have Lost in Love is such a great song. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah. No, I like that you mentioned the Shame remix, and it's so I was listening to that just a couple of days ago, and it'd been a while since I'd listened to it all the way through, and it was Shame, right? That you said,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's right.
And it is, and I love some of those remixes that when I go back to them, like Shame, that I really hadn't listened to in a while. Interesting.
They really build and add so much. I think nowadays remixes can be so avant-garde and completely disconnected to the original material. I think what was great about some of those 80s remixes, they were additive to the original track, and you could really still feel part of it. And I think the ones for Savage in particular really did that.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Today's remixes they don't even sound like the songs anymore, you know. I have to give Lady Gaga credit. She put out a remix album, and when I listened to it, I thought, I don't know if am I going to like this? But it kept the original spirit of the songs, and it didn't change, you know, into something completely different. But
there's the classic story, isn't there, of Aphex Twin, and then he was commissioned to do a Bjork remix, and the courier had turned up at his house to get the tape, and he hadn't done it, so he just picked something up and gave it to them, and it was nothing to do with Bjork, as I understand it, and this was the remix because he hadn't done it.
Oh, so that's how it all started, huh? No, but I'm glad you mentioned Shame, because, you know, I know critics have said that's one of their finest singles, you know, and I kind of agree with that. You know, not the biggest hit, but such a great song, and so much to say in that song about society and about consumerism and all sorts of things, and
which still rings true today, I believe.
Yeah. Oh, completely true. Yeah.
And it gets lost in the shuffle. Even, you know, it was set apart from almost everything else on Savage. Really, it was its own thing, its own being. Yeah. It's what an interesting list. I like that a lot. Very nice.
Well, my favorite album is obviously Savage. It has to be Savage. For that, I've got, you know, so many amazing memories of listening to that growing up, and it's such an about turn from Revenge, so clinical. I absolutely love that record and play it from start to finish. And over the last few years, I've been trying to find all the additional mixes and tracks and stuff that were on 12 inches or obscure remix albums, and I think my deluxe edition in my iTunes library is now 26 songs, which is just brilliant. I just love that album. Every single song in it is a classic.
Yeah, sure is.
Are you doing a top 5 of your albums, or are you just sticking with...
No, that's just Savage. Yeah, that's just pure class for me.
Okay. Now, you started out after you I don't know. Well, you said you worked in a record store once, very early. You know, I guess one of your first jobs or something. And
yeah, so I always wanted to be a musical theatre actor. That was my thing when going through high school. So at 18, I was trying my best to get into drama college. And as a big music fan in my hometown, I knew the owner of the record shop very well. I was in there all the time. And I remember one day going in on my 19th birthday. I'd been at work since like 4 a.m. I was a shelf stacker at a local supermarket. You know, everyone's got to start somewhere. And she knew I wasn't very happy in this job. and asked me, you know, was I thinking about something else? And I was very tired. Obviously, this was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I said, why, do you want to offer me a job? And she went, yeah, come in and we'll talk about it. So I landed this amazing job in my local record store back when, you know, independent record stores in the UK really meant something. And I view my 4 years at Trading Post as my degree in the music business. So I did everything from window displays, buying the stock, marketing campaigns, accounting, everything. I learned so much. And working for a record shop, you are exposed to so much music that I'd never been exposed to before. My whole mind was open to a whole different array of music. It was wonderful, and it's one of the highlights of my life, really.
Wow. Did that help you get into the music business, or how did that happen?
Yeah. So in the early days, we would have reps that would turn up with their Ford Mondeos, usually, you know, with boxes and boxes of CDs in the back, and sell the CDs to us or give them away to us so that we could, you know, help give them away in the store to help them in chart positions. And then as the music industry changed, we became more reliant on telesales. So the record companies would then have people at the end of the phone selling you the music rather than visiting you in person. And I struck up a relationship, a very good friendship with my contact at BMG, Lucy Richardson. If you're listening, Lucy, hope you're well. Because of Annie and Eurythmics, I was like, I'm going to make sure I keep on good terms with these guys because I want to know more. And I remember once, I think it would have been 1997, so 2 years after Medusa had come out, I would always ask, is there a new Annie album coming? Is there anything coming? And one day she said, yes, there is. It's on the schedules. But if it comes out, I will eat my desk, which has stuck with me, that phrase. And it didn't come out, obviously. It didn't. There was another album for another 6 years. But that was my introduction into the music business. So when I moved to London in 98, I got a job in a bookshop, which I hated. I was looking after poetry, erotica, and religion, a really interesting mix of books. And I hated it. I hate that job. And I quit after 2 weeks. And whilst I was working my notice, Lucy phoned me up and said, hey, I've just been promoted. Why don't you apply for my job? So that was it. I had my interview at BMG in Putney and got the job. And I started in September 1998, you know, because I jumped the fence from buying records to then selling records. So I was then doing what she did, which was sell records to record shops.
Now, what was the title for the job? What was the job?
Telemarketing.
Okay. And that's your introduction to, and then this is BMG?
Yep, this is BMG. It was just wonderful to walk in. I remember we had a sales conference in Brighton. That was sales conference time. And the week before I started, I ended up in this fancy hotel down in Brighton on the south coast of the UK, pinching myself because I'm like, oh my God, I've got this amazing job. And here I am in this hotel and I'm mixing with record company executives. And had, you know, at the conference dinner, I sat next to Olive, the band Olive, you know, You're Not Alone, from 1997, which was a big hit here in the UK. I can't remember if it was anything in the US, but I was like living my absolute fantasy job. I'm like, I'm work for a record company. I am an employee, and I might get to meet Annie. I might get to do something with Eurythmics. You know, it was that exciting.
Yeah. And that eventually did happen. One of your first projects was working. How closely did you work with Dave and Annie on the Peace album? How did any of that come about?
So that was I started in September 98, and then they were awarded the Outstanding Contribution Award at the Brits in February 99. So I'd been there like 5 minutes. So I didn't really have anything to do with that album apart from selling it to the record stores. But the most interesting story I have around that was the market research we did around the album cover. So as everyone knows, Richard Avedon did the photography. and I think if I remember rightly, and I just have to say, I'm no longer an employee of BMG or Sony BMG. This is all my personal recollections and my personal experiences from the time. And this is now going back, a long time ago, half my life ago, in fact. So this is all personal recollections. But I think at the time we paid Richard Avedon £1 million to do the photographs. It was a big deal. Eurythmics' first album in 10 years, and they were such a massive part of BMG's success in the 80s. And then along came these photographs, including some of the backs of their heads, as we all know. So we did some market research where we went and took a group of the public into a room, and all the images, including the one of Annie holding Dave's head and them looking at each other, and gave them to the public to give them, what do you think of these? What's your view of this? Do you like this? Would you buy an album with this? And remember, this is long before the days of social media or smartphones with cameras on your phone. So nothing would ever have leaked out because of that. And I remember people were kind of baffled that an album cover might show the back of someone's head. But ultimately, that was what Dave and Annie chose as the album cover. That's what they wanted to go with. It was very much let's go against expectations, which I think really sums up their entire career, right? But that was a really interesting snapshot as an employee, but a fan, to kind of go, oh, wow, this is how decisions are made. This is how an album cover comes to be.
Yeah, from all the pictures that they showed, were there other ones that people liked better? Like maybe the one with his head under her arm or something like that? Or were there people that actually liked the actual cover that came to be?
If I remember rightly, there was a little bit of horror within the record company leadership about the choice. I think the standard headshot would have been great, or them looking at each other. But ultimately, the artist has a lot of control over what happens. It's their music, it's their content, it's their creation, right? So in the end, they went with what we all know and love as the back of Annie's head.
The back of his head too.
They have had these things over the years. I know Clive Davis was not sure about the Bear cover back in the day, and she ended up explaining it, right, in the liner or something.
I always thought that was unusual that she explained it. Yeah,
well, for someone like Annie, and I think everyone's familiar with the term A&R, artist and repertoire, which back in the day would have been pairing a songwriter's song with an artist. So here is a song, here's an artist. How do we put them together? A&R. With an artist like Annie, she's not A&R'd by anyone. She does her own A&R. So when you're at the stature of someone like Annie, the success that you've had, you deliver. I mean, this is back then, right? And I'm sure it stands the same today. You deliver a finished product to the record company and say, hey, here's my new album, right? It's not a case of the record company kind of going, we need you to do this or we need you to do that because it's Annie Lennox.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, again, and I think I've said this on this podcast before, Clive Davis in his autobiography talks about that, and he, of course, the American record company president, but he talks about that he viewed Annie as an artist, and that he thought, okay, we could give her this load of songs and she would be huge and massive, and he said it was always interesting. He was always intimidated by her in a little bit of a sense, and I always thought that was so strange that this man who had created so many people and had done so many albums, and that and he said that in a positive way, in the sense that because she was such an artist, she wasn't going to be dictated to, and he knew that, and he wasn't even going to bother trying to do that. So it's interesting. So when did you first have the opportunity of your lifetime and meet Dave and Annie? When did that actually happen?
Oh, so I'll just give you a little step between that. Okay. So I had the opportunity to change jobs. So I was in the sales department selling records. and I had the opportunity to go and work in the commercial division, which is like, you know, the division that would do all the back catalog stuff and the non-frontline products, with a guy called Charlie Stanford, who enticed me into the commercial division by saying they were looking at doing the remasters or the repackaging of all the Eurythmics albums. So I started that process in 1999 with Charlie on the side. In the end, I ended up staying in sales and I got promoted up through. And by the time I left in 2007, I was head of sales for Columbia Records UK after the merger. But so I was working on all the reissues. But my first time of actually meeting Annie was for the Bear album. And a few of us went up to the studio to listen to the album for the first time. Sarah Silver, who was the head of international, I think she either knew or was the cousin of Stephen Lipson, Annie's producer. So she said, let's go up and listen to the album. So it was the first time the record company had heard it. So there's people from TV and radio and press and sales. None of us expected Annie to be there, right? Because we're just going to go and listen to the album. And I walked into the studio and there's Annie fucking Lennox stood in front of me. I mean, literally, how old would I have been? I was 28, literally was gobsmacked. Oh my God, there's my icon. There is Annie Lennox. And I'm about to listen to her new album for the first time anyone's ever heard it with her. So we sat and we listened to the album, and my eyes are just like boring into her. She's on the other side of the room, and she's obviously she's really taking in the music and listening to it in a different way because there's other people here for the first time. And the album finished, and she looked up and she said, "That's really dark, isn't it?" That was her first description of the album, because obviously it was very personal about her split from Yuri Fruckman. And I was just beside myself with joy. Like, you know, the inner kid was there, like really thinking, I can't believe this is happening. The little kid that grew up loving this woman's music, and here I am in a professional capacity. And she, we had a conversation as a group, and she made a comment about the fact there was very few women there. There was only a couple of people from BMG in TV and promotions that were there. So, her activism and her belief and her support of women and women's rights around the world, it stems everywhere. She lives that on a daily basis. And as we were leaving, I thought, this is my chance. I may never get this opportunity again. So I went up to her and I said, I just wanted to tell you that I'm a massive fan, and you should know that somebody who really loves your music is working on this project and really believes in you, and it's not just a job. And she took me by the hand, held me by the hand, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Thank you so much. That means so much to me." And I started to well up, and then somebody pulled me away. Get Wickens away from Annie Lennox. That was just wonderful, just magical. You never think you're going to meet your idols, and then here I am working on her project.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I love that at the end of it, that she acknowledges how dark it is. But I also love that at the end of all that, you were in this sense of so much, as you just put it, joy. And even after listening to that album, which of course any of us can listen to that album, which is one of my favorites, in so many different ways. And I think too, it was very interesting that you said that she acknowledged from the people in the room that there were not a lot of women, because I think that is a very because of the subject matter. I think I think perhaps it speaks to women in a different way. Not that men can't understand it, of course we can, but because of the divorce and because of what she went through, and I think just even on a recent podcast that Rex and I were talking about, she could have talked a lot in interviews about that album from this very personal sense that I think a lot of people could have acknowledged and felt, going through those same emotions of a shattered marriage or whatever. So anyway, it was very interesting. But again, to go back to that she acknowledges, boy, this is dark, isn't it? And you're back here, you know, in some row, like, oh my God.
Well,
yes.
and the last song on the album is so dark anyways, you know, oh God. I mean, it ends on such a,
yeah.
Actually, I've said this before and I'll say it again. I think Bear should be listened to in reverse. Because if you listen to it in reverse, that's the trajectory of a failed relationship. You start out with, oh God, what has happened to me? And you end up at the end with 1,000 beautiful things. You come out of it and you're happy and you've recovered. Or
that's a good one.
But if you look at the track listings, if you do it in reverse, it's kind of like the end of a relationship, the hell the person goes through emotionally, and then the end where they come out of it and they're a stronger person.
Is it sort of like what is it, the 5 stages of grief, and you end up with
right
at the end?
And of course, I'm not saying that it is actually that way done in reverse, but you know, oh God could never have been the first song on the album.
No.
So
I'm going to do that. I'm going to listen to that in reverse. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, I mean, think about it that way. Think about the steps you go through when you've been through a breakup. The first step is, oh God, right?
Yeah, so, yeah, I am divorced myself. So yeah, I can really empathize with that. Of course, the ultimate divorce song is obviously ABBA's "The Winner Takes It All," which I listened to on the day my divorce came through, which was 6 years ago today, actually.
Oh, well.
We're happy about that. We're happy about that.
Okay, all right. Never know how to quite take that, but so that's 2003.
Yep.
And coming up fairly quickly is the remasters project.
Yes.
And I if I remember what you and I have talked about, you were very involved with that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, myself and Charlie Stanford, we did that whole project together, which was, you know, like a kid in a toy store, right? I was basing my own personal desires as a fan of the music balanced out with what we were allowed to do from a record company perspective. And, you know, I've read lots of people's comments and thoughts about the reissues over the last however many years it is, 18 years. And I try not to take some of it personally, because I know at the end of the day, it's my name on the label as a music consultant, right? But I worked on that for 6 years. And, you know, you can see here my pride of place, the Eurythmics box behind me. There were so many variations on what that could have been. I wanted it to be double discs, you know, like Pet Shop Boys with their Further Listening packages. To me, I think they're the epitome of what a great remastered package should be. And I was basing what I wanted to do on that, but I wasn't allowed to do that from a budget perspective. And I've just moved house. I'm in a new place now, and I've been going through a lot of boxes and found lots of stuff. And we actually meant to release the remasters in 2003. I have a sales brochure from 2003 detailing what we wanted to do, but then Bear album came out. So then we were like, okay, we're going to shelve that for now, and we're going to do it next year. And the starting point for any repackaged album, remastered album, is the master tapes, right? So it's what's in the archive, what's in the vault, what have we got to play with above and beyond the album tracks that everybody knows. And I remember having this box arrived with all the tapes from the archives, and you're like, oh my God, this is gold dust. This is so valuable. Again, I can't believe I'm getting to do this. I'm being paid to do this. One thing that we did find, that there's, at the time, couldn't find everything, right? There wasn't every single thing that had ever been released was available in the vault. So there's quite a few of the early B-sides, for example, that at the time, if I remember rightly, we couldn't find. So that's a reason why some of them aren't on Sweet Dreams, because we just didn't have them. I know lots of people have commented around sometimes remasters are done from vinyl from a 7-inch, and you can hear that a mile off. And we didn't really want to do that. And plus, Dave was in charge of the remastering. You know, he had approval on everything. So they weren't what I wanted them to be, but I was really happy with them when they finally came out. The big mistake, and I will apologize for this, is the Eric Thorngren mix of Would I Lie to You, which was a complete balls up, because that was mislabeled on the masters. But I think either end of the last year or this year, it's finally been released digitally on a compilation.
Yes.
So I've updated my own track listing in my iTunes to make sure that that's right. But I do apologize for that, but that was mislabeled.
I've been waiting for that, and to when I saw that was coming out, I'm like, please, please, please let them get it right on this compilation.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you know, I've talked about that before, and it's so interesting to hear you talk about it and how it was mislabeled, because I always thought that was the case, because you could see how easily that could be done. ET extended, EXT period, how easily things like that can happen. So let me go back for just a moment, if you let me. Maybe other people knew this. I never knew this, because you even talked about it a few minutes ago. I never knew that the remaster project, Ultimate Collection, whatever, was that long in the process. I think you a moment ago, it could have started in '99, or even that it was that long. That's fascinating to me.
It is. What takes?
Well, if you think back to 1999, Eurythmics had done a performance for the outgoing BMG president, John Preston, the year before, first performance they'd done in 8 years. And out of that was formed the seeds of what ultimately became Peace. And the record companies all take turns in being the chairman of the Brits. And so somebody thought it would be a good idea to get Eurythmics together to do that as a launch for what might come that year. So the idea to do the remasters came out of that, because all of a sudden there was this press and interest in Eurythmics catalog again. They were working together, they were talking to each other, and it was about maximizing the potential on that. But then the Peace album came out, and then it was decided, you know, let's focus on that rather than the reissue. So it gets pushed out for whatever reason. And then they went on tour, and then Annie did Bear, and then, you know, all of those things get factored into how a record company will release material. Definitely back in those days, it's very different now. It's a very different industry. It's much more immediate. Yeah. But in those days, you really have to plan, when are you going to do this? When have you got access to the artist to promote it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, if there hadn't have been the Peace tour and Bear and all that, and nothing had interfered like with the remastering project, how long do you think it would have taken to come out? 1 or 2 years maybe? Or
yeah
I'm just kind of trying to get a sense of how long a project like that takes, you know, to do.
Well, I first started working on it in '99, and they came out in the autumn of 2005. Yeah. So ultimately it took 6 years.
Right. But you were delayed because of, so if there were no delays, it would have been more like a couple of years or something. I'm just trying to get a sense of how long it would take, you know, if there were no.
Yeah, because there's, you know, the whole process of remastering an album takes time. Yeah. Phil Savage, who did all the sleeve notes, you know, he has to do all the interviews, and then working with, sorry, there's a fly in my flat. Get off. You can edit that out. Working with Lawrence, right? So he went back to all of the original pieces of artwork, and famously corrected the square on Sweet Dreams album, which he said to me absolutely haunted him every time he saw it, because the line at the top of the square box wasn't straight. So he was able to do that digitally, you know, and that takes time. So all of these things add up to taking time, which makes the process quite long and drawn out, and people tend to then lose a little bit of interest because it's coming and then it's not, and then you have to go back to the drawing board, and then the artist will say yes or no. I know lots of fans, and I've read lots of people, and I think you talked about this on one of your podcasts about a track called Armadillo.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, but go ahead.
Which I have heard.
Yes,
and I used to have.
So tell us in one sentence, how would you describe that song?
Very much like an electro dubby, offcut from somewhere between In the Garden and Sweet Dreams, quite avant-garde. But I had a whole box of CDRs of all this archive material, which was again super exciting. This is before we had iTunes, right? So I don't have it. So before you ask, I don't have it. I had to give it all back because Dave and Annie ultimately decided, as is their right, it's their music. Yeah. They were like, these aren't finished. These are songs that aren't fit for public consumption. We don't want to put them out. So as much as I would have loved to have them on those remasters, it wasn't my decision.
So let me ask you about that, because more and more we see special albums, double albums, special releases, and artists are giving fans those exact kind of things that you just said that Dave and Annie would say, well, that's not finished. That's no. But you see a lot of bands and artists saying, okay, here's the first demo of this song, and here's the second demo, and here's the third demo, and you take that as it is, and you may not listen to that demo like you would the final version, because it isn't quite, and then again you may, it just depends. But they've always, I think we've heard them talk about that. We don't do a lot of these things, and or back in the day you could see Sweet Dreams where they went through several incarnations of the songs. I could give you a Mirror being a great example of that. But a lot of fans are getting some of these things from different artists. Was that something not done back in the time, or was it simply Dave and Annie saying they couldn't be convinced? Like, did the record company, did you or the record company ever say, but I think fans would like to hear this? It's interesting. It's part of your. So can you talk about that?
Definitely. I mean, as a music fan, as well as at the time working for a record company, and to be honest, I struggled sometimes working for the record company because I could see everything that it took to get an album onto a shelf in a record store, obviously very different nowadays. And I really struggled because it kind of took my love of music and going to buy CDs and records away a little bit. But as a fan, you do, and as somebody that was, selling the records, you have a sense of the commerciality of a release. And obviously you say to an artist, this is going to sell better if you've got something on there that the fan doesn't have. I remember being in a scheduling meeting and we were talking about a Whitney Houston single release around the greatest hits that had come out. And the person in the meeting, I won't name names, the person in the meeting said, this is what we usually do with Whitney. And I was like, but that was on the last single. That's not of interest to the fans. That's you're not giving the fans what they want. You have to try and deliver something that's different, that's got a different remix or a different B-side or whatever that might be, so that you really get fans engaged to help drive the single up the charts, not just put the same old B-side that you had last time, because that doesn't work. So to answer your question, absolutely, I made the case that having these tracks would make the album reissue much more interesting to a fan who may go, well, I've got the album, I've got the singles, I've got these all already, but actually I don't have this unreleased track, I'm going to buy it. But at the end of the day, it's their decision. Sure. If they don't want to release something, nobody can force them to do it. I think we've talked, we're all fans of ABBA as well. Benny and Bjorn are very similar in that respect. They don't want to release unfinished versions of songs because they're not done. We got ABBA Undeleted in 1994, but they're like, we don't want to release all this other stuff because it's not what we want to do. I think on the Visitors repackage, there's that from a twinkling star to Like an Angel Leaving, whatever that track is, and you see that progression, how the songs change, all the demos, which I thought was a fascinating insight into the creative process. But I think you have to respect that sometimes the artist just doesn't want to, open the kimono and show what's behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I can get that. And you can appreciate that and understand that. What other can you tell us about any other songs that you might have heard that we have never heard?
Yes, I have heard, and I actually do have a copy of, but I'm not never going to release it. That's not my music to release. But I do have Everlasting Love, which was part of the TVP project. So that was quite exciting, hearing all those cover versions and adding them onto the repackages. I don't know why we didn't add that, if I'm honest. I can't remember why it wasn't used. I think it was because it just didn't fit on In the Garden. You know, if you've got In the Garden, which doesn't have one of those cover versions on it, and then all of a sudden it's that Everlasting Love at the end, you're like, what's this? You know.
I want to ask you about the My Guy. Was it always that short?
Yeah.
Because it just seems like it just sort of cuts off, you know, like it's just done.
Yeah.
And it leaves you wanting so much more. I love that sort of electro version of My Guy, and then it just ends.
And last night I
don't want it to end. What?
Yeah, you want them to carry on, because I think it was George Harrison, wasn't it? They were doing that project with George Harrison. It never quite got to see the light of day. I've also got a snippet of Annie singing Close My Eyes and Count to 10, which is very beautiful, but it's literally only about 40 seconds. That just was on a CDR. But the other stuff.
What is that from? What era is that from?
I'm not sure. I don't know. It's just her vocal.
It's a Dusty Springfield song?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Oh, interesting. So so all these things exist on some sort of recording
somewhere.
Then how does it somehow get to the record company? How is it just not in Dave and Annie's studio? I mean, I don't even think I understand how that works.
So you have to remember that an artist is signed to a label, and the label owns the copyright to those recordings in general, standard. So they own the masters. When Annie was doing her solo stuff, it was her company, La Lennox, which was exclusively licensed to RCA BMG. It was one of the biggest fights, I think, in history was always Prince was fighting against Warner's for control over his masters, George Michael as well. You know, you control them, you make the music, but you don't own the rights to it. So it's very important to remember that if there is stuff that's been delivered to the record company, it becomes their property. And you can argue about the pros and cons of that approach, but historically that's how it works.
Yes, but how does a 40-second clip make it to the record company? How is that just not something that you're fiddling around with?
Yeah.
Somewhere that gets delivered for, I don't know, for a B-side, or this needs to go into the vault, or whatever the agreement is. Yeah. And this is, we're going back a long time. This is 30 odd years ago, 40 odd years ago. And contracts were very different back then. You know, I think artists and management are much more savvy now in how they go about licensing their music. Like the current BMG, the current incarnation of BMG very much acts as a conduit for artists who own the copyright to their own recordings and just use BMG as a conduit who provides marketing and distribution. But, you know, they still own, the artist owns the copyright now, which I think is a fairer system personally.
Let me go back to one thing you said a few moments ago about that some of the early B-sides and sort of things, they simply could not be found, the masters of them. What worries me now, let's say that Sony, is it Sony Legacy or something now? Is that what it's called? Anyway, they want to do something again. Isn't that, I mean, how much more difficult is it after all of the years that have now passed to even find these? I mean, how difficult is it to find these things, and they're all cataloged somewhere, or hopefully cataloged, or perhaps what you mentioned, were either not cataloged correctly or in the wrong space?
Yeah. I think it's obviously been some time since I was an employee at BMG, Sony BMG, but I think artists and record companies have become much more aware of the need to protect these masters. we all know the story of Universal and the fire at one of Universal's archives, where not only the original masters, but the copies of the masters went up in flames because they were stupidly held in the same place, right? And that's it, gone. You know, the opportunity to remaster those tapes disappears. So if Sony have done an exercise to kind of like bring everything together and protect, you know, that's where they make the money, is the ability to monetize the master tapes of the artists, right? That's how they make their money. So I would hope that they have maybe pulled things together into one place. I mean, over my shoulder here, you can see the Catch single that I've got here. This is the thing that I would love for somebody to find the master for and digitize, so we can get those two songs finally on a streaming platform. But again, it's about what was done at the time. The Catch was a band that only released one single and morphed into the Tourists in the late 70s. You know, did people really understand the need to keep hold of masters in the same way that we do today? I don't know. So it's all about how much somebody cares about the masters that belong to the record company.
Yeah, and particular and the Catch there, you know, there was no reason for someone to think necessarily, you know, what's going to happen in a few years. Then, so it's human life gets in the way, and you kind of move on, and you've all been there.
It'll be in a box. It'll be in a box somewhere. Someone who doesn't know who the Catch are just thinks, well, what's this? And it'll be sitting somewhere in a dusty box, because, you know, that's in my head. I'm thinking that I have to believe that somebody will find it one day.
Yeah. Well, that's how a lot of it happens. You hear stories. I just discovered it. It was at the bottom of this. I just came across it, and here it was. Yes, I have faith that will happen.
Well, I do know and have access to someone who has some early Catch recording. Yeah.
Wow. What is different to the singles?
That was sold on eBay many, many years ago, and it's the real. So it's quite fascinating. Yeah, but the point of that is that those kind of things exist, and they exist in some form or another. It's not necessarily a master, of course, but it's a fascinating moment in time that could be so fascinating on a Eurythmics, you know, some sort of look back, and that you could go back that far and like, here's the process and the progress of getting somewhere. But you were at some of the early promotional with Dave and Annie and for the remasters project, correct?
Yeah, that's right. There was an art exhibition in a gallery here in London, and they were an installation. You know, they sat there in their silver suits with their eyes closed next to each other. Well, bit like what you've got behind you there with all the posters. They just had all the posters of all the artwork and images of their career around them. And then there's Dave and Annie sat there. And I'm going to show you the box, which literally arrived. Charlie gave it to me as we were walking in. So the Eurythmics box, which everybody knows, which has all of the 8 albums inside. And I was privileged enough to be able to deliver Dave and Annie their copy of the box and say, here you go, here's what we've been doing. And they knew of me, and I'd met Annie before, but they knew because everything got signed off by them, and we sent stuff to them, and we got their approval to do whatever it was we were doing. And so I don't know if you can see this, but in the middle of my box, it's signed by both Dave and Annie, saying thank you for all your hard work.
Lovely.
This obviously is priceless to me. This is a pure fantasy dream boy. This is my finest thing.
Yes, it's when you get something like that, suddenly everything else in your collection is not as important, is it? I mean, it's still important, but not as important as that.
Not as important as that, because it's both of them signed it, and it's something that I've worked on, and my name is on there as well. And I have a picture in my house of myself and Annie at that event, which takes pride of place.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That must have been a great time for you for so many different reasons, that, you know, that all these things coming together, like you said, just the culmination of so many things.
Yes, I mean, it was very special to be part of it, to work on it. You know, things like listening to I've Got a Life for the first time, in the BMG's boardroom, and thinking, wow, this is the first new material in 6 years. This is a real banger. This is amazing. Willing it to get to the top 10 so that we could have another top 10 hit. Listening to Into the West for the first time in my office. A CDR had turned up, and Jed Doherty, the president of the music division, came down to my office and said, you need to listen to this. So I put my headphones on and turned this song up loud and just cried all the way through it. Those moments of bridging the gap between a fan and somebody that works in the music business. And there aren't a lot of people, I would say, that were really, they just were doing a job. There weren't that many people that were into it as I am. Not the stuff I liked anyway. And then things like working on the Annie Lennox collection, and presenting feedback to her on how it should be presented and what should be included. And that's why we have the second disc, for example, because we were making a case for Into the West to be included on that, but she felt, again, it was a little bit too dark and wanted to, well, maybe we could put it on a second disc. Okay, that's a great idea. Here's the other things that we can do. And I really wanted to do a remastered release of Under Pressure that she did with David Bowie for the Freddie Mercury concert, because I'd worked on the Lisa Stansfield Greatest Hits project in 2002, 2003. And we'd put on her track from that concert with permission from Phoenix Trust. So I thought we could do the same for Annie, but in the end, that idea didn't go anywhere because that had never been released. It's only on YouTube. And I thought that would be an amazing thing to kick off. And the final idea that I had, kind of like you said about going full circle, Rex, is about who could we introduce an artist of the time with Annie to perform. So I came up with the idea of Annie doing a duet with Beth Ditto of The Gossip of an old Tourists track to kind of like bring that full circle, which went to her and her management team, but ultimately wasn't taken on. She went with their cover of the Ash song. Yeah, but I thought that would have been a really good thing to do.
That's very interesting because there's photos of Annie with Beth Ditto from around that time, so they clearly met each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw the Gossip on Cyndi Lauper's True Colors tour, a few years back.
Oh, great band.
About 10 years ago, yeah. But yeah, that's interesting. Wow.
Let me go back for a moment on the Ultimate Collection. There are 2 new tracks, and there was always discussion of a third. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah,
do you remember
like a duet with Kellis or something?
I'm sorry, Rex, what did you say?
Well, Dave Stewart used to say that there was one unreleased track, from Ultimate Collection, I Got a Life, and Was It Just Another Love Affair? But there was a third song they had done as a duet with Kellis, the singer Kellis.
Oh, that's news to me, and no, I never heard that. No.
Oh, okay. Well,
sorry, I can't help you on that one.
They talked about it. It was talked about in interviews at the time by Dave. So we're all wondering. There's a song out there with Eurythmics and Kellis.
I never heard it. Never heard it. Never saw it.
Well, then I'm wondering. So did you feel like you it's been kind of weird, you almost apologized a minute ago, like, well, I know the remasters aren't exactly what some fans would have liked, but you don't feel responsibility for that, do you? I mean,
100%. 100%. It was my decision where these tracks were going to be. What was the track listing going to be? Where were they going to be placed? What were the covers going to be on which album? What could we use? What would be of interest? And obviously, when you've only got one CD, there's a finite amount of time on a CD. You can't put everything that you want on one CD. So there were compromises that were made, and obviously mistakes were made with Would I Lie to You, ET Mix, as we've talked about.
But you go back to, that you said there was a budget issue. You would have preferred a 2-disc set for each album. But what can you tell us about budget issues? I would imagine that record companies have so much money they're going to put into a project.
I mean, that's always the assumption, but there isn't. Every project has its own budget, right? You've got X amount of money to spend on that budget. If it's a brand new album, then that budget might be helping them with studio costs, or hiring a band or hiring a producer. If it's something that's a repackage, then it's hiring the designer, hiring somebody to do all the interviews, do the artwork, and then marketing that particular project into the market, right? So you don't have a finite amount of money, and if you budget out how many pieces do you think you're going to sell, how many units you're going to sell, how much revenue is that going to generate? So that gives you, okay, how much money do we then have to spend to make this project happen? So it's all about balancing all of those different factors to go, right, here's your budget. Sometimes you get more money if it starts to look like it's going to be really successful, or like with the greatest hits, how much money are we going to spend on TV advertising, which was, how you drove things back then, not so much now. So it's all about how do you bring all that together? And that makes, if you want to then create 2 CDs, that's twice your manufacturing costs, because you've still got to create 2 discs, right? So it all adds up. And somebody, above my pay grade at the time made the decision that, we didn't have that amount of money to spend. We had to stick with 1 disc, much to my dismay.
I wonder where Eurythmics would fit into these kinds of things today, because there is, in my mind, there's sort of a sense that even maybe more than in 2005, that there is an interest in Eurythmics, at least, that has, they seem to me to have gotten to that level of massive respect that they may not have even had in 2005. And I think people have respected Eurythmics, of course, for a long time. Of course, I'm not saying that they didn't, but they have seemed to get to this level of, you don't hear anyone disparage Annie Lennox. You don't see that. You go on some YouTube, and it's any YouTube of Annie singing anything, whatever it is, or a video, and there's all these people from around the world, talking about her in this most glowing comments. So I think it's been built upon itself that there's a massive amount of respect for both of them.
Sure.
That may not have even existed back in 2005. It would have, you're still, not far off from, actual projects happening and that kind of thing.
I think there is a general love for Annie and for Dave and the legacy that they've had. Sweet Dreams has had over 1 billion plays on Spotify, for example. So it still resonates today with a lot of artists that are coming through today, because it's such an unusual sound. And we've seen them inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Songwriters Hall of Fame. And I think the love for them and their music is still there. When the nominations, and then when they were announced that they were being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame last year, came out, I contacted one of my friends at Sony Music and said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" And he was like, "We're not really doing anything," which I was really saddened by, to be honest with you, because there's so much knowledge out there. You guys and Steve at Ultimate Eurythmics, we could really deliver an amazing package which would have all of those extra tracks on, if we can find them, and would be a 2-disc set and would really deliver what the fans want. But I don't know why the decision was made that they didn't want to do it. I don't know if it's something that Dave and Annie didn't want to do, but they certainly haven't appeared as yet, which is a real shame.
Well, I know that I recently talked to somebody at 19 who told me they don't know any plans this year for anything being released, not for Sweet Dreams 40th or even for Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So
it's sad.
We just continue to wait.
Yeah.
In the meantime, we have remastered albums. Be nice to get remastered videos.
I mean, Savage album video would be just amazing. But that's not owned by Sony. I think it was Virgin at the time, so it would be Universal now. So somebody at Universal. Actually, that would be good, because that's 1984 and the Savage album video could be done at the same time.
I bet you the Savage video album would sell better now than it did back in the day if it were released.
Yeah. that I think people would go bonkers for that. If you really did that well and you went back and got all the various videos and all the, I'm sure there are interviews. What you could do with that is amazing. Let me ask you really quickly. I thought about this when you just mentioned 1984. Of course, 1984 was not part of the boxed piece. Different record company. I'm assuming that was that.
Yeah.
What about? Go ahead. Sorry.
We didn't have the rights to that, so it wasn't something that we could do with. And I don't remember any conversations happening with Virgin at the time as to why they didn't want to do it at the same time as us. But that would be great. You know, I've really got into that album again recently, and it would be nice to hear that remastered with whatever's in the archives for Virgin. But that's up to them.
Well, even from a podcast perspective, Rex can probably talk more about this, but we've done, I think is this our 25th podcast?
25th.
I think it is. But one of our early podcasts was about the 1984 album, and it still remains to this day our most downloaded podcast, which is always surprising to me. But I think there's a set of people who really adore 1984. It is more than Sweet Dreams, more than Touch. It is a culmination for people that it's the Eurythmics album project. So it's very fascinating. I think Virgin or whoever would be at this point could do really well with that. And it's probably not one of those things that a record company, maybe you can speak to this, I think it sold well, but it wasn't Sweet Dreams. It wasn't Be Yourself Tonight. It wasn't Revenge in the sense of sales, I'm assuming. And so I think maybe looking back, it may be difficult for record companies to say, well, that wasn't the most popular album. Why would we go back and do that?
But also you have to think that Eurythmics as a group were signed to RCA. So they had a team at RCA all through the 80s that were managing that band, product managers, marketing managers, A&R guys, sales guys, press, radio. They were focused on that artist as a band for that roster. Whereas 1984, from a purely business perspective, was a soundtrack for a film that was put out by a label who obviously had a deal with their film studio to release the soundtrack. And I won't go into the story around the soundtrack, that's well documented. I'm sure you talked about it as well. But there was no one there that's then fighting for Eurythmics as a group at Virgin because they weren't a Virgin artist. So it was released, I would imagine, and then quietly put down because there's nothing else they can do with it.
Right. So it would be a difficult kind of, it wouldn't necessarily be a conversation that's coming up, even if it just that kind of thing. So again, go back to Boxed, Touch Dance, and Eurythmics Live, the live album. Clearly, those were albums that could have been included. Were there ever any discussion? I know they're kind of like offshoots, but was there ever any discussion that those could be in Boxed as well? Do you recall?
I wanted the second disc of Touch to be Touch Dance remastered. But again, we couldn't do that. We weren't allowed. So it wasn't deemed a big enough release to be able to pour it into an album on its own. And yeah, I don't know why we didn't do Eurythmics Live, which is a great album, especially the third disc with all the acoustic tracks. And I remember buying that as a fan in 1993. I got my A4 card that came in the post saying, hey, this album's out, brilliant. I don't know why we didn't do that, but I think we were just purely focusing on the studio albums.
Yeah, that makes sense, I guess.
Really interesting conversation. And I absolutely knew it would be, because not a lot of people get to have this experience that you've had, to go from very young fan who grew up in a household where music was important, but specifically these two, Dave and Annie Eurythmics, were important or loved, by parents and a sibling and you.
Yeah.
And it was a dream come true for you.
It was a dream come true. Yeah. I mean, I still, when I listen to their music now, I still have conversations with my sister about, I can't believe I had dinner with Dave and Annie after they were inducted into the UK Hall of Fame. I did that. This is a kid who grew up in Gloucestershire in the west of the UK, and I worked on these things. It's a real. I'm so proud of what I did. I'm so happy that I had that opportunity, and that Dave and Annie allowed me to play in their world for that brief amount of time, and I was just somebody that would help get their music into the marketplace.
Did it ever become normal, or when you were in those special situations, or was it always? Did you always have to pinch yourself? Clearly you could the right to be there. You were part of the company, but did it ever? Was it always special?
Always special, yeah, absolutely. It wasn't just a job for me. What's the saying? Do what you love, and you'll never work a day in your life, right? My job was my hobby, right? So I was going to gigs like 4 nights a week, sometimes 2 gigs. You would, take some buyer at HMV to a little gig for a new band that you were trying to push, and in return you get them tickets to see Alicia Keys or Rod Stewart or whatever it was. So there was that element to it, so that was pure joy. It wasn't work for me. It was literally living my hobby. And when you have a bond with an artist, like Dido introduced me to her dad as the man who sold all her records in 2003, which was really, I don't sell all your records. I'm just somebody that works in the sales team. But, things like that. And I spent my 29th birthday in the studio with Faithless listening to their new album in 2004. And Rollo used to come sit in my office and talk to me about their records because they didn't have management. That was just normal. And the most difficult thing would be, you come home from work and you meet your mates at the end of the day or the weekend, and they say, oh, how was your week? Oh, I hung out with Dido, or I hung out with Westlife, or I had dinner with Lisa Stansfield, or whatever it was. After a while, people go, oh, you're just showing off. And I'm like, actually, no, I'm just telling you about my week. This is what I do. So after a while, I would stop. I just wouldn't say. I'd just say I work for a record company. And then obviously when Simon Cowell, who I worked with at BMG before he was Simon Cowell, became famous as a judge on Pop Idol and X Factor, it would be like, oh, you work with Simon? Oh, do you work for Simon Cowell? I'm like, no, I work with Simon Cowell. There's a big difference.
Yeah, very big difference in that. But is there, Rex, do you have anything?
No,
you wanted to bring up?
We covered the Annie Lennox collection, which is what I wanted to bring up too, and we talked about that. I can't think of anything else now, unless Neal has something he wants to say that he hasn't said so far, or I don't know.
I mean, at the end of the day, I'm still a massive fan, and I've always got Eurythmics on. And there's a guy, Steve Hart, who's been doing a project on building a CD single collection, which has been fascinating to watch. So it's inspired me to do that in my own iTunes library, to create the singles, and then you realize just, oh, I don't have that version, oh, I don't have that version. And I'm
maybe when he's finished creating all the singles, and then Lawrence will finally get the go to do it, and it'll really come out.
Well, I keep saying to Lawrence, because we chat on Instagram, there's so much love for his work that he should do an artwork book and do it via Kickstarter, because I think there would be a huge appetite for that. Because even again, looking behind you, Mark, all the artwork is so iconic. It's so incredible to have a big coffee table book of all of that artwork and the different iterations that he will have in the archives, because they're amazing. I think people would lap that up. And I still think, to your point, Rex, everyone still wants to listen to and see more of Dave and Annie and their journey over the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
Totally agree. And totally agree about Lawrence. And I know Rex and I do the same thing, and have said to him, that's fascinating that you've done that same thing. Like, a book of this, all of these things, what you could do. I hadn't even thought about the Kickstarter or something like that. But I've said to him, we've said it on podcasts before and interviews, I always think Lawrence is another one of those people who was so important to the history of Eurythmics.
100%.
The look that he created and the designs were incredibly important. And I love his story. I love it like I love your story in this sense, but I love his story. He was in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
And his entire career changed because he walked into that record company, hoping to get a job as a designer. And they just happened, Dave and Annie just happened to be there. And that's just fascinating.
Yeah.
But I love that kind of stuff about life anyway. So that always fascinates me. But it's been so really great to talk to you. And I think you and I have like talked over time over a little bit, and we've seen you on the the Facebook boards and all that kind of stuff. And just like you mentioned Steve Hart a moment ago, his project has been so fascinating.
Yeah.
I've been so into that because I have all those things and how he's been specifically doing it and what specifically he's going to include. But you can see what a fascinating project that would be. I'd love for, someone at a record company, or I don't know if Dave and Annie see those things, but, and I think people look at it differently than from fans. And I think that is probably that we benefited, whether you know it or not. I think all fans benefited from you being there and that you were a fan. And you may say, I know this wasn't exactly what everyone was looking for, and it could have been slightly different. But I will have to say, getting the remasters project, that was huge as a fan. I mean, was it absolutely 100% perfect? Nothing's ever going to be 100% perfect. But man, it got us a lot of stuff that we hadn't heard. It got us a lot of stuff that we had not had remastered clearly, and some B-sides and some remixes. Do I want more? Yes.
Yes.
We want it all.
I mean, I think we can, what I've said to Steve is like, I will get that in front of the people that I know still at Sony. If you deliver a kind of like, hey, here's what it could look like, here's half the work done, then it allows them to kind of like maybe run with it. Who knows? But I think there's definitely something we could get in front of those guys and say, hey, how about this? Because so many people are doing those big, I've got one here, that ABBA and the ABBA singles, and I think Wham are doing it this year, which is Sony again. So I think there's a real appetite if we can just present it to the people in charge at Sony and go, hey, you should be doing this as a market for it. We will all rush out and buy it.
Yeah, totally.
I'll be in the front of the line. We would love to have you back on any future podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you.
We so appreciate all your insights and sharing all that stuff with us. And like, I have to echo what Mark said, the remasters thing was great. And I know that you worked on it. So you have your little opinions about this could have been better, or I'm sorry about that. But like Mark said, the fans, we were so happy to get it. And whatever little things were not right, you don't care about it. You just you notice it and you move on. You're just happy to have what you have. And so
that makes me feel so happy, because I am a fan as well, as we know, and I am part of those Facebook groups, and I'm surprised that people haven't put two and two together quicker, because I had always thought, oh my God, people are going to hate me because I got this track wrong, or I couldn't find this. Because if it was me on the other side, I'd be like, oh, you've done it wrong. So I've carried that for years. So for you to say that is really good for me. I feel like I've been absolved of my sins.
Yes. And I think no sins, but I think when all the fans hear this podcast, I think I wouldn't be surprised if you see some comments echoing the same thing.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you. It's been great. I've really enjoyed this. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Please come back. Well, we can, I don't know what we talk about any further, but we could just pick a subject and talk with you about it. I'm really fascinated that you were so young when you got into Eurythmics. That really fascinates me, because at 8 years old, I wasn't even listening to music yet.
Well, when I was 3, I was obsessed with Debbie Harry. So 1978.
Well, that was my first. Well, ABBA was first, then Blondie, then Eurythmics.
So for me, I remember Debbie Harry, and then it was ABBA. So I'm a massive ABBA fan. And my parents, as I say, and my sister just had music on all the time. So music is just part of my very soul. So I've always got music on. I'm always listening to music, going to gigs. It's something I'll never ever get away from.
I think that's the interesting thing. And I'm sure it's the interesting thing about the three of us and so many other people. I really do not understand people who like music in the background.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
it never has.
Well,
I internalize, whatever it is. It may be Eurythmics, it may be someone. I've internalized music so much, and it means so much to me in a lot of different ways. But I don't understand people who aren't like that. And
right.
not that they're bad people. It's just music means a lot to me in whatever form.
Well, as Madonna once sang, music makes the people come together.
No, there you go. Well, on that note, I think we'll stop the podcast at that and on to the next. But I think we can find many different podcasts that you'd be a great guest on. So
sure,
look for
another
sometime soon, I suspect.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.